It sounds like the plot of a movie. A U.S. man was able to hide behind a false identity, operating a sophisticated illegal drug website. The site operated much like eBay. It allowed users to buy and sell illegal drugs, guns, and even hire hitmen. The FBI spent 2 years trying to find the man behind the site. And as Mike Drolet reports, there's a Canadian connection to how they finally got him.
Me, on day one, I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht. He's already served 11 years. We're going to get him home.
That was then candidate Donald Trump making a campaign promise at the Libertarian Party National Convention to pardon Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht.
I guess I shouldn't generally say this kind of thing, but I really liked the Dread Pirate Roberts that I interviewed. I thought he was, a really super interesting guy with a really coherence.
Hi, welcome to Crime Daily Series. Today we are talking about the story of Boy Scout who built a billion-dollar drug empire. The library is quiet. That specific kind of quiet keyboard clicks, a page turning somewhere, the hum of an air conditioner working too hard against the San Francisco fog outside. It's October 1st, 2013. Glen Park Branch, a small neighborhood library tucked between a laundromat and a coffee shop that nobody outside the block would ever notice. At a corner table near the science fiction section sits a 29-year-old man, plaid shirt, laptop open. He looks like every other 20-something working remotely on a Tuesday afternoon, earbuds in, coffee going cold beside him, eyes locked on the screen. His name, as far as anyone in this room knows, is Josh Terry. That's not his real name. It's not even close. What he doesn't know, what he can't know, is that at least 4 of the other people in this library aren't reading, aren't studying, aren't killing time on their lunch break. They're watching him. They've been watching him for weeks, following him from his apartment, cataloging his routine, learning exactly when he sits down, exactly when he logs on, exactly what it takes to get him to look away from that screen for the 3 seconds they need. Because on that laptop right now, this man is logged into a website that federal agents have spent 2 years trying to tear apart. A website that funneled more than $1 billion in illegal transactions across the globe. A website whose anonymous administrator has, according to federal prosecutors, arranged to have 6 people killed to protect it. They call that administrator the Dread Pirate Roberts. They believe that name and this man typing quietly in the corner of a public library are the same person. But belief isn't enough. They need proof. They need him logged in, hands on the keyboard, the evidence live and undeniable because the second he suspects anything, he could slam the laptop shut and years of encrypted secrets could vanish in under 2 seconds. So they wait. And then, without warning, a shout breaks the silence. 2 men near the back of the library start shoving each other, voices rising, chairs scraping the floor. It's loud. It's exactly the kind of scene that makes everyone in a quiet library turn their head, including him. For a fraction of a second, his eyes leave the screen. That's all it takes. A hand reaches from behind him and slides the laptop off the table before he can react. He turns back just in time to see it disappearing from his grasp, and that's when the arms wrap around him from behind, pulling him back into the chair before he can stand. Within seconds, it's over. The fight was staged. The laptop is in federal hands, still open, still logged in. The man sitting in that library thought he was invisible. He thought 3 years of careful planning had made him a ghost. He was wrong, and the story of how he ended up in that chair, how a well-liked Eagle Scout kid from Texas became one of the most notorious criminals in the history of the internet, starts more than a decade earlier, in a much quieter place. Before we rewind to the beginning, if stories like this are your thing, hit subscribe now, because we're about to trace every step that led from a Boy Scout meeting in Texas to a federal library takedown in San Francisco, and you don't want to miss where this goes. Rewind to 1984, Austin, Texas. Ross Ulbricht is born into a stable, middle-class family. His father, Kirk, works as a physical therapist. His mother, Lynn, keeps the household running, and his younger sister, Kara, grows up right alongside him. By every account from people who knew the family, this isn't a chaotic household. It isn't a troubled one. It's ordinary, in the best sense of the word. And Ross, by all appearances, is an ordinary kid doing extraordinary things. He's sharp in school, the kind of student teachers remember. But it's outside the classroom where Ross really stands out. He joins the Boy Scouts of America, an organization built around a simple promise: help other people, stay honest, do what's right even when nobody's watching. Ross doesn't just join, he excels. He climbs all the way to Eagle Scout, the highest rank in the organization, reserved for the scouts who demonstrate real leadership and real character. It's not a rank you can fake your way into. It takes years of service projects, merit badges, and a review board that digs into who you actually are. People who knew Ross during this period describe him consistently: intelligent, principled, gentle. Not the profile you'd expect to end up at the center of a federal racketeering trial. His academic performance earns him a scholarship to the University of Texas at Dallas, where he studies physics, a subject that rewards exactly the kind of disciplined, methodical thinking Ross has shown his entire life. He graduates, and the momentum keeps building. Next stop, Pennsylvania State University, where Ross is accepted into a graduate program, pursuing a master's degree in materials science and engineering, with his sights set on an eventual PhD. On paper, this is a young man on a clear, upward trajectory: scholar, scientist, someone whose future looks less like a courtroom and more like a research lab. But Penn State is where the story quietly starts to bend. It's not a single event. There's no dramatic breaking point in these early years. No crime, no arrest, nothing anyone around him would have flagged as dangerous. What happens instead is smaller and in some ways more unsettling. An idea takes root in Ross's mind. An idea about freedom, about ownership, about what a person should be allowed to do without government interference. It's the kind of idea that, in a philosophy seminar, sounds abstract, academic, harmless. It would turn out to be anything but. Quick one before we keep going: where are you watching this from? Drop your city below. I want to see how far this story is traveling tonight. Graduate school changes people, not always in the ways you'd expect. For Ross, it isn't the coursework that reshapes his thinking, it's the conversations happening around campus, in dorm rooms and late-night discussion threads, about a political philosophy that was gaining traction in certain corners of the internet during the late 2000s, libertarianism, and its more extreme cousin, anarcho-capitalism. The core idea is simple enough to fit on a bumper sticker. You own your body, you own your choices, and as long as you're not directly harming someone else, no government has the right to tell you what you can or can't do with your own life. For a lot of people, that idea stays exactly where it started: a talking point, a debate topic, something you argue about over coffee and then set aside. But Ross doesn't set it aside. He absorbs it. He starts to see it not as a philosophy to discuss, but as a problem to solve. If people should be free to make their own choices about what goes into their bodies, Ross reasons, then the laws criminalizing drug use aren't just inconvenient, they're a fundamental violation of personal liberty. And if the law is the obstacle, then the solution isn't to protest the law. The solution is to build something that makes the law irrelevant. This is where Ross's thinking starts to drift from mainstream libertarianism into something sharper. People who would later study his writings, journal entries, forum posts, his own words describe him less as a libertarian in the traditional sense and more as something closer to a revolutionary. Not someone asking for smaller government, someone imagining no government at all, at least in the marketplace of goods and services. It's worth sitting with that shift for a second, because it's the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. Ross doesn't wake up one day and decide to become a drug trafficker. He talks himself into believing he's doing something noble, building a tool for human freedom, a real-world experiment in what a truly free market could look like, stripped of government interference. In his own mind, at this point, he isn't planning a crime, he's planning a crime. That distinction matters because it's what allows a former Eagle Scout, a young man who once swore an oath to stay morally straight, to walk, one rationalization at a time, towards something his younger self would never have recognized. He finishes his master's degree in 2009 and heads back to Austin, Texas, ready to build something. He doesn't know yet what that something is, but the seed is already planted, and the world is about to hand him 3 failures in a row, right before it hands him the success that would change everything. Here's something the headlines never tell you about Ross Ulbricht. Before he became the internet's most notorious drug kingpin, he was, by his own admission, kind of bad at business. Back in Austin, fresh out of grad school, Ross tries his hand at day trading, buying and selling stocks quickly, hoping to catch small price swings and turn them into profit. It sounds simple in theory. In practice, it requires capital Ross doesn't have and a stomach for risk he hasn't developed yet. The venture fizzles. Next, he pivots to something closer to his interests. A video game startup. Ross has the technical background for it, the coding skills, the problem-solving mindset. But building a company from nothing is a different beast entirely, and this venture collapses too. By this point, Ross is keeping a personal journal, a habit that will later become one of the most damning pieces of evidence ever used against a defendant in a federal criminal trial. Though he has no way of knowing that yet. In it, he writes something raw and unfiltered. He describes feeling ashamed of where his life has ended up. He'd left a promising path in science to try his hand at business, and so far, he has nothing to show for it. It's a strikingly human moment in the middle of a story that's about to turn very dark. This isn't a criminal mastermind confidently plotting his empire. This is a 25-year-old who feels like he's failing, writing it down at 2 a.m. because he doesn't know what else to do with the feeling. Then comes a small, almost accidental opportunity. Ross's downstairs neighbor invites him into a modest business venture, buying used books in bulk and reselling them online for a profit. It's not glamorous. It's not going to change the world, but it works. Ross starts making steady money for the first time in years. And it's in this quiet, unremarkable success, reselling paperbacks on the internet, that Ross starts to see the outline of something much bigger. If ordinary goods can move anonymously and profitably online, why not build a marketplace with no limits at all? No categories excluded, no government oversight, no rules except the ones the market sets for itself. The idea that started as a philosophy discussion in a Penn State dorm room is about to become a website. Enterprise has a founding problem to solve, and Ross's was this: how do you build a marketplace for anything, including things that are explicitly illegal, without leaving a trail that leads back to you? Ross approaches it like the scientist he was trained to be. Break the problem into its components. Solve each one individually. Component 1. Anonymity of location. For this, Ross turns to a piece of software called Tor, short for the Onion Router. Tor routes internet traffic through multiple encrypted layers across servers around the world, making it extraordinarily difficult to trace a connection back to its origin. It's the backbone of what people call the dark web, the portion of the internet that isn't indexed by normal search engines and isn't accessible through a standard browser. Ross builds his website to live entirely within this hidden layer. Component 2. Anonymity of payment. This is the harder problem. Credit cards leave paper trails. Bank transfers leave paper trails. Even cash, at scale, is difficult to move without eventually surfacing somewhere traceable. Ross's solution is to build the site around a relatively obscure and volatile new form of currency at the time: Bitcoin. In 2011, Bitcoin is still a fringe technology, understood by almost nobody outside of tech-forward and libertarian internet circles. But it offers exactly what Ross needs: a way to move value across the internet without a bank or government intermediary tracking every transaction. Put those two pieces together, an untraceable browsing layer and an untraceable currency, and Ross has built something law enforcement has never really had to deal with before. As one investigator would later put it, cybercrime cases are usually cracked one of two ways: trace the IP address or follow the money. Ross's design, intentionally or not, closed off both roads at once. He spends months writing the code alone, largely in isolation, turning an idea into a functioning platform. And even in the privacy of his own journal, Ross can't fully contain his excitement about what he's building. On LinkedIn, a professional networking site of all places, he posts a description of his project that reads less like a business plan and more like a manifesto. He's creating what he calls an economic simulation, designed to give people a taste of what life would look like in a world without the systematic use of government force. It's a strange thing to post publicly. It's also, years later, Exactly the kind of digital breadcrumb that federal investigators live for. But that's a problem for future Ross. Present Ross is focused on one thing: launching. In early 2011, at 26 years old, Ross takes the site live. He names it Silk Road, a nod to the historic network of trade routes that connected Asia and Europe for over 1,000 years, moving goods across cultures and borders long before anyone had a concept of international trade law. The name is aspirational. The history books remember the original Silk Road as a marvel of early globalization. Ross, it seems, imagines his version the same way, not as a criminal marketplace, but as a legitimate evolution of free trade, just one that happens to operate outside the reach of any government. In his journal, Ross writes with the kind of confidence that only makes sense in hindsight, given what's coming. He believes he's about to enter a year of prosperity unlike anything he's experienced. He predicts Silk Road will become a phenomenon. He's right about that part. He has no idea yet what that phenomenon is going to cost him. There's just one problem standing between Ross and the thriving marketplace he's imagining: a brand new website, hidden on a part of the internet almost nobody uses, has exactly 0 buyers and 0 sellers. Somehow, Ross has to solve that too, without ever revealing that he's the one who built it. You can build the most sophisticated hidden marketplace in the world, but if nobody knows it exists, it's just an empty website floating in the dark web void. Ross has a product with 0 users, and no legitimate way to advertise something explicitly designed to facilitate illegal transactions. So he improvises, and what he comes up with is, from a pure marketing standpoint, genuinely clever even if the product being marketed is anything but legitimate. Ross creates an online persona, a username called Altoid. Under this identity, he starts posting on internet forums frequented by people interested in drugs, cryptocurrency, and internet privacy forums like Shroomery, a community built around discussions of psychedelic mushrooms. As Altoid, Ross doesn't announce himself as the creator of anything. Instead, he plays the role of a curious bystander who stumbled onto something interesting. He writes posts describing Silk Road as if he's just another internet user who heard about this strange new website, a hidden marketplace where you can apparently buy and sell almost anything anonymously. He asks, casually, whether anyone else has heard of it, whether it's legitimate, whether it's worth checking out. It's a masterclass in manufactured curiosity. Real people read these posts, get intrigued, and go looking for Silk Road themselves, never suspecting that the curious stranger who tipped them off is the same person who built the site in the first place. The strategy works. Traffic starts trickling in. In the very beginning, Silk Road's product catalog is almost laughably small mushrooms that Ross has grown himself, listed as the site's very first product. But a small marketplace with real transactions is still a marketplace. The first sale happens, then another. Word starts to spread through the same underground forums Ross seeded with his fake enthusiasm. Soon, Silk Road stops being a one-man operation. Other sellers from more than a dozen countries eventually start listing their own products, organized into clean, browsable categories. Ross builds out seller guides to help vendors avoid detection and implements a rating system so buyers can review sellers after a transaction, not unlike the review system you'd find on any mainstream e-commerce site. That last detail is worth sitting with for a second. Ross isn't just building a black market bazaar. He's building the infrastructure of legitimate e-commerce and applying it with startling effectiveness to an illegal marketplace. Trust systems, vendor accountability, customer service norms. It's Amazon's playbook, repurposed for a market Amazon would never touch. And it's working faster than Ross ever expected. So fast that it's about to collide head-on with the one part of his life he hasn't figured out how to compartmentalize: the woman he loves. Real quick, if you've ever watched someone you care about disappear into an obsession, piece by piece, you're going to feel this next part. Stick around, because what happens to Ross's relationship here says a lot about what he's about to become. And if this story's got you hooked already, the like button helps more people find it. Hit it before we keep going. Before Silk Road, before Dread Pirate Roberts, before any of it, there was Julia. Ross met Julia V. while he was a graduate student at Penn State. She was a freshman at the time. He was several years ahead of her academically, but the two connected immediately. Their relationship grew serious enough that when Ross finished his master's degree and moved back to Austin, Julia made a significant sacrifice to stay with him. She left school and relocated to be by his side. For a while, it works. They build a life together in Austin. In the same period, Ross is drifting through failed businesses and used book resales, still years away from the idea that will define Werg and ultimately destroy his future. But everything changes once Ross tells Julia about Silk Road. Her reaction isn't excitement or curiosity, it's fear. Julia understood, in a way Ross himself seemed to minimize, exactly what he was risking. She worried, correctly, that this project could get him arrested. That worry didn't go away. If anything, it deepened as the site grew. And it wasn't just the danger, it was the toll the project took on their day-to-day life together. As Silk Road demanded more and more of Ross's attention, he began disappearing into their bedroom for hours at a stretch, hunched over his laptop, coding, moderating, managing a business he couldn't tell anyone about. What used to be shared time became isolated time. Julia wanted to go out, to live a normal 20-something life. Ross, increasingly, treated anything that pulled him away from the screen as a waste of time he didn't have to spare. Julia later described the frustration plainly. She found herself angry, over and over, at a partner who seemed to have quietly checked out of the relationship in favor of something he wouldn't even explain to her. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. She ended the relationship and moved out. What makes this particular breakup worth pausing on isn't just the heartbreak. Plenty of relationships end over one partner's obsession with work. What makes it different is what Julia said afterward, reflecting on what had actually driven them apart. It wasn't really Silk Road itself, in her telling. It was the isolation. The pressure of being made to carry an enormous, dangerous secret with no one to share the weight of it, and no say in whether she wanted that weight in the first place. Ross loses the one person who might have talked him off this path before it went any further. And with nothing left pulling him back toward an ordinary life, there's nothing left standing between him and the version of himself that's about to take over completely. He's about to get famous. And fame, for a man running a hidden criminal marketplace, is the most dangerous thing in the world. For its first few months, Silk Road exists in relative obscurity, a niche marketplace known mostly to people already embedded in dark web and cryptocurrency communities. That obscurity was, in a sense, Ross's best form of protection. A hidden website that stays hidden doesn't attract federal attention. That protection ends in June 2011. A tech blog called Gawker publishes an article describing Silk Road in vivid, almost breathless detail and a hidden website, they report, where users can anonymously buy nearly anything, including illegal drugs and forged documents, all shielded from law enforcement by technology that makes the site impossible to trace. The article is meant as a piece of internet culture journalism. Functionally, it operates as the biggest advertisement Silk Road has ever received. Within days, traffic to the site explodes. People who had never heard of Tor or Bitcoin or dark web marketplaces are suddenly typing Silk Road into search engines, curious to see if the claims are real. Ross documents the spike himself, later writing in his journal about the moment Silk Road got its first real taste of mainstream press Euro, and the surge in new users that came with it. For a brief moment, this might have felt like validation. The site Ross built in relative secrecy was suddenly a topic of public fascination, drawing in exactly the kind of user base he'd need to make his libertarian experiment thrive at scale. But virality cuts both ways. The same article that brings in thousands of new customers also puts Silk Road squarely on the radar of the people Ross least wants paying attention: federal law enforcement. Ross feels the shift almost immediately. In his journal, he writes about a new and unfamiliar kind of dread, the recognition that the United States government, which he describes as his primary adversary, is now aware of what he's built, and that some of its most powerful agencies are actively calling for his takedown. This is the moment Silk Road stops being Ross's private ideological project and becomes a target. From here forward, every decision he makes is shaped by the reality that people with subpoena power and unlimited resources are actively trying to find him. He needs to get sharper, more careful, more paranoid, if that's what it takes to survive. And, as if summoned by that exact need, someone is about to enter Ross's life who will teach him precisely how to think and operate like a real criminal. Every origin story has a moment where the central figure crosses from amateur to professional. For Ross, that moment has a name attached to it: Variety Jones. Jones enters the picture through Silk Road itself, an older, more experienced user who quickly distinguishes himself from the site's typical customer base. He isn't just buying and selling, he's offering strategic advice: how to tighten security, how to scale the operation, how to think about Silk Road not as a hobby project, but as an actual, sustainable business with a brand people could trust. Ross, still largely self-taught and improvising as he goes, is drawn to Jones almost immediately. In his journal, Ross describes Jones as someone who helped him see a larger vision, someone whose intelligence made Ross feel, for maybe the first time since this whole project began, like he wasn't navigating this alone. By 2012, the relationship has formalized. Ross begins paying Jones for his guidance, at times as much as $60,000 for a single consulting session. It's an extraordinary sum for advice from someone Ross has never met in person, communicating entirely through encrypted messages. But by this point, Silk Road's revenue makes that kind of expense almost trivial. Of everything Variety Jones contributes, though, one piece of advice stands out as the true turning point. He suggests Ross adopt a public-facing persona, separate from his own identity, to serve as the face of Silk Road going forward. The name Jones proposes is Dread Pirate Roberts, lifted from The Princess Bride, where the title isn't tied to a single, real, unchanging person. In the film, the Dread Pirate Roberts is a role, a legend passed from one person to the next, meaning no single individual is ever truly exposed as the man behind the myth. It's an ingenious piece of psychological armor, and Ross recognizes it immediately. On February 5, 2012, he makes it official, posting an announcement to the Silk Road community introducing his new identity. From this point forward, he is Dread Pirate Roberts. What happens next is worth sitting with, because it's the real hinge of this entire story. Adopting an alias doesn't just protect Ross's identity, it changes how Ross experiences his own actions. Psychologists have long understood that people behave differently under the cover of anonymity, and Ross, whether he recognized it explicitly or not, was about to become a case study in exactly that phenomenon. As Dread Pirate Roberts, Ross's paranoia and his ruthlessness both sharpen. Aware that the FBI, DEA, and other federal agencies are actively hunting him, he tightens security across every part of the operation. When he brings on remote staff to help manage the growing site, he requires them to submit scans of their real government identification, your Elijah loyalty test, disguised as an administrative formality, ensuring that if anyone ever betrayed him, he'd know exactly who to find. He layers heavier encryption onto his own systems. He even begins exploring citizenship options in countries that might shield him, and his growing fortune if the walls ever started closing in back home. Ross the Eagle Scout believed in rules. Dread Pirate Roberts believed rules were exactly what he'd built this entire empire to escape. But an empire built entirely on trust between anonymous strangers has a fatal weakness. It only takes one person breaking that trust to bring the whole structure into question. And in January 2013, one of Ross's own employees is about to make a mistake that pushes Dread Pirate Roberts somewhere Ross Ulbricht, the Boy Scout, never should have gone. Not every villain in this story works for Silk Road. Some of them wear badges. In January 2013, a Silk Road employee named Curtis Clark Green is arrested in a sting operation conducted by the DEA. Two of the agents involved in his arrest are Carl Force and Sean Bridges, both members of a Baltimore-based federal task force specifically assembled to take down Silk Road. Carl Force had, for some time, operated undercover on the site itself, posing as a vendor using the username Knob. Through this persona, Force built an ongoing rapport with Dread Pirate Roberts, two anonymous internet users who had, over months of messages, developed something resembling a working relationship, neither aware the other was exactly who they claimed to be pretending not to be. After Green's arrest, Force and Bridges pressure him into cooperating, and Green, facing serious federal charges, gives up what he knows: site details, internal operations, and critically, his own employee login credentials, which included access to a portion of Silk Road's Bitcoin holdings. This is where the story takes a turn that would be almost unbelievable in fiction. Instead of using this access purely for the investigation, Agent Sean Bridges secretly logs into Silk Road using Green's stolen credentials and begins quietly siphoning Bitcoin out of the system, transferring it into his own personal wallet. A federal agent, sworn to investigate Silk Road, decides instead to rob it. Investigators who later reviewed the case describe Bridges' calculation bluntly. If he couldn't be certain of making the arrest himself, he'd at least walk away with the money repurposing stolen cryptocurrency for entirely personal gain. Ross, on the other end of these transactions, has no idea any of this is coming from a corrupt federal agent. All he sees is roughly 20,000 bitcoins worth approximately $350,000 at the time, vanishing from an account tied to his own operation. His reaction is fury. And this is the moment the story crosses a line that can never be uncrossed. Ross turns to Variety Jones for guidance on how to handle the apparent theft. The two discuss simply frightening Green into returning the money. But Jones pushes for something far more severe, an example so brutal that no one inside the organization would ever consider stealing from Dread Pirate Roberts again. Jones's recommendation: eliminate Green entirely. Ross agrees. According to court records, he responds that he'd have no problem wasting the man he believed had betrayed him. They need someone to carry out the job, and in one of the darkest ironies of this entire case, the contract goes to Knob, the same undercover DEA agent Carl Force, who had arrested Green in the first place. The two sides agree on a payment of $80,000. Of course, Force has no intention of actually killing anyone, but he has every intention of keeping the money. So he stages it instead, forcing Green to lie on the floor of a room, dousing him in canned soup to simulate blood, photographing the scene, and sending the fabricated proof of death to Ross in exchange for payment. Ross believes at this point that he has just paid to have a man murdered. It's the first time, but according to prosecutors, it will not be the last. Once someone crosses the line from theoretical ideology into ordering a killing, even one that, unbeknownst to him, never actually happened, something shifts. The next time it comes up, the decision comes faster. In March 2013, a Silk Road user known as Friendly Chemist attempts to blackmail Ross, threatening to leak the identities of thousands of Silk Road customers unless he's paid $500,000. Rather than negotiate, rather than pay, Ross allegedly turns once again to violence as the solution. This time he hires someone using the alias Redandwhite, agreeing to pay $150,000 in Bitcoin for the job. Within days, Ross reportedly receives photographic evidence that the blackmailer has been dealt with, and the payment goes through. Over the following months, according to federal prosecutors, Ross orders hits on 4 additional individuals, each one someone he believed posed a threat to Silk Road's security, his own identity, or his fortune. 6 people, total, targeted for elimination in under 2 years, by a man who once swore a Boy Scout oath to help others and stay morally straight. It's worth pausing here on something the prosecution itself would later have to grapple with. Despite ordering these killings, investigators were never able to find evidence that any of them were actually carried out. Whether that's because the hitmen Ross hired were like Carl Force, running elaborate scams of their own euro, taking payment while faking the results, or because the killings simply never happened for other reasons. The deaths Ross believed he had orchestrated appear to exist only in his own mind. That detail doesn't make what he did any less serious in the eyes of the law. Attempting to arrange a murder of believing you've successfully paid for one carries the same intent, the same culpability, regardless of whether the person on the other end ever intended to follow through. What it does reveal, though, is something almost stranger than a straightforward murder-for-hire story. A man sitting alone behind a screen, increasingly convinced he was a ruthless crime boss, capable of ordering executions with a few typed messages, while, in at least some cases, the people taking his money were quietly laughing behind their own anonymous usernames, running their own version of a con. Dread Pirate Roberts believed he had become a kingpin who decided who lived and who died. In reality, he may have simply become someone so deep inside his own alternate identity that he could no longer see how thoroughly he was being played by the very people he thought he controlled. Either way, the money kept flowing, the site kept growing, and somewhere in Washington, federal investigators were closing in on a single, tiny technical mistake that was about to unravel all of it. We are not even at the arrest yet. If you think you know how this ends, wait until you hear how one investigator cracked this case with nothing but a Google search. Smash that like button right now if this story has you hooked, because the next 15 minutes are the reason this case became a legend. By the summer of 2013, Silk Road has grown into something almost unimaginable when Ross first launched it 2 years earlier. The most sophisticated, extensive criminal marketplace the internet has ever seen. What used to require underworld connections and real-world risk buying drugs, buying stolen data, buying forged documents, now took nothing more than a Tor browser and a Bitcoin wallet. Dread Pirate Roberts, meanwhile, has become something of a folk figure in certain corners of the internet. He even sits for interviews with journalists during this period, speaking with what comes across as total confidence that his anonymity is airtight, that no matter how big Silk Road gets, the technology protecting his identity will hold. He has no idea that confidence is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. During this same period, FBI investigators identify a flaw buried in Silk Road's own code euro. Not a weakness in Tor itself, but an error in how the site's login page had been configured. One that inadvertently leaked the real-world IP address of the server hosting the entire operation. It's a small thing, a configuration mistake, the kind any developer might make in a project this complex. But it's enough. Investigators trace that IP address to a data center in Iceland. At this point, the FBI faces a choice. They could shut the server down immediately, taking Silk Road offline and ending the operation on the spot. Instead, they choose a riskier, more patient strategy. They quietly create a mirror image of the entire server, too, an exact digital copy of everything on it, without alerting anyone that they've found it. This decision turns out to be enormously consequential. With a complete copy of the server, investigators can now see everything. Every transaction, every private message, every administrative action taken by Dread Pirate Roberts himself, going back to the earliest days of the site. What they find is staggering in scale. In under 2.5 years, Silk Road has processed roughly 1.2 million transactions, generating close to $1 billion in total revenue. But for all that data, there's a piece still missing. None of it directly reveals who Dread Pirate Roberts actually is in the real world. The mirrored server shows everything the site does, but not who's sitting behind the keyboard doing it. There is, however, one small detail buried in the server's login records. The site's main administrator consistently logs in from a computer identified, in the system, by a single word: Frosty. It means nothing to the FBI yet, but hundreds of miles away, working an entirely different angle on the same case, an IRS investigator is about to figure out exactly why that name matters, using nothing more sophisticated than a search engine. All right, one more before we get to the breakthrough. What's the weather like where you're watching from right now? I'm always curious how many time zones end up in one comment section. While teams of federal agents are pouring resources into tracing servers and analyzing blockchain transactions, the break that finally identifies Dread Pirate Roberts comes from somewhere almost nobody expected. An IRS investigator named Gary Alford, working the case from an entirely different angle. Alford's strategy is refreshingly simple, almost old-fashioned in a case built on cutting-edge cryptography and hidden servers. He wants to find the very first mention of Silk Road anywhere online. His logic: someone had to be the first person to publicly talk about this site, and there's a good chance that person was either Dread Pirate Roberts himself or someone extremely close to him. So he does what any of us would do. He types Silk Road into Google. Buried in the results, he finds a post from January 2011 on a Bitcoin discussion forum posted by a user with the handle Altoid. The post describes Silk Road almost like a pitch, comparing it to an anonymous version of Amazon, and offering step-by-step instructions on how to actually find the site on the dark web. Alfred recognizes what he's looking at immediately. This isn't someone stumbling across Silk Road after the fact. This is someone who clearly knew about the site before almost anyone else did, which lines up exactly with the marketing strategy Ross had used to seed the site's earliest users, all those months ago. Alfred keeps digging into Altoid's other posts across the internet and finds something even more revealing, a message from October 2011 in which Altoid is trying to recruit a programmer for what's described as a Bitcoin-related startup. It's a small ask, buried in a forum post that most people would scroll right past, but at the very end of it, Altoid includes a real contact email address for anyone interested in applying. That email address contains a real name. Alfred now has something no one else investigating this case has had before, a specific, named individual tied directly to the very first public mention of Silk Road anywhere on the internet. Still, a name attached to an old forum post isn't proof. Alfred keeps pulling the thread, eventually landing on Stack Overflow, a popular website where programmers post and answer coding questions. There, he finds a post from March 2012, asking a technical question specifically about how to connect a piece of software to the Tor network, the exact anonymity technology powering Silk Road. The post was made under that same real name, and then, less than a minute after posting, the user changes their display name to Frosty. When Alfred brings this discovery to the FBI, it initially doesn't land the way he expects. Agents are intrigued by the trail he's built, but skeptical after all. Plenty of people are curious about Tor and Bitcoin without secretly running the largest criminal marketplace on the internet. But then Alfred mentions the name change, Frosty. The reaction in the room shifts instantly, because Frosty is the exact username investigators had already identified through the mirrored server pulled from that data center in Iceland as Silk Road's primary administrator account. Two completely independent investigations, one built on forensic server analysis, one built on a single Google search, have just converged on the exact same name. Investigators dig further and find more corroborating evidence, including that strange LinkedIn post from years earlier, where this same person had described building an economic simulation meant to demonstrate a world without government force. The FBI now believes, with real confidence, that they know exactly who Dread Pirate Roberts is in the real world. What they don't have yet is the one thing that actually matters in a courtroom. Proof that puts his hands directly on the keyboard, running the site, in real-time delete. Proof that can't be argued away by a defense attorney claiming mistaken identity. They have 10 days to get it. And if they move too early or too clumsily, they risk giving him the warning he'd need to disappear completely. 10 days. That's the runway federal agents have between identifying their suspect and securing an arrest warrant, and every one of those days matters, because Ross, still operating under the alias Josh Terry, has no idea he's already been found. Agents descend on San Francisco, where surveillance confirms Ross is living, and begin quietly tracking his daily movements, where he goes, when he goes there, what his routine looks like on an ordinary day. They need more than a location. They need a moment, a specific window where they can arrest him while he's actively logged into Silk Road as Dread Pirate Roberts, laptop open, no room for a defense built on mistaken identity or a claim that someone else was controlling the account. And there's real risk baked into whatever plan they land on. If Ross realizes what's happening even a second too early, he has options few criminal suspects ever have: instantly encrypting his files, wiping his hard drive, or simply slamming the laptop shut, potentially destroying the single most valuable piece of evidence in the entire case in less time than it takes to blink. The plan they settle on requires precision. A Silk Road employee named Cyrus had been arrested months earlier, and in the process, federal agents had quietly taken control of his account, giving them a trusted internal line of communication directly to Dread Pirate Roberts himself. On October 1, 2013, agents used that access to send Ross a message through Cyrus's account, asking him to check on a flagged issue on the site Euro, a routine, unremarkable request, exactly the kind of message an administrator handles dozens of times a day. Ross responds that he'll take a look and logs in. At that exact moment, plainclothes agents already positioned throughout the library patrons, who had spent the better part of an hour blending seamlessly into the quiet afternoon crowd, watch as Ross begins typing, confirming through his own actions that he's accessing the Silk Road administrator account. Then comes the staged distraction. Two agents erupt into a loud, physical altercation near the back of the room, drawing every set of eyes in the building, including Ross's. In that instant of distraction, an agent slides in and lifts the laptop cleanly off the table. Ross catches the movement out of the corner of his eye and instinctively reaches for it, but before his hand can close around it, he's pulled backward into a restraining hold from behind. It's over in seconds. According to those present, Ross's initial reaction looks almost like confusion, as if his first assumption is that he's simply being robbed before the reality of federal identification and formal arrest registers. Agents immediately check the laptop screen. It's exactly what they hoped for. Ross is actively logged into the Dread Pirate Roberts administrator account. Live. Undeniable. The device itself turns out to be an evidentiary goldmine: fake identity documents, encrypted chat logs, and Ross's own personal journal, the same one he'd been keeping since his failed day trading days back in Austin, now containing years of detailed first-person documentation of exactly how Silk Road was built, run, and defended. Within hours, federal agents shut Silk Road down entirely. News of the arrest spreads almost instantly, described by media outlets as the takedown of the most sophisticated criminal marketplace the internet has ever produced. Ross is charged with an extensive list of federal crimes, including money laundering, conspiracy to traffic narcotics, and running a continuing criminal enterprise, a charge historically associated with major drug cartel leadership. He pleads not guilty. His legal team is about to argue that the FBI got the wrong man entirely. The trial begins in January 2015, and from the outset, Ross's defense doesn't dispute that Silk Road existed, or that it caused real harm. Instead, they build their case around a much more specific claim. Ross Ulbricht created Silk Road. Yes, once Euro, but he wasn't the one running it by the time of his arrest. According to the defense, Ross built the site as something closer to an academic thought experiment, a real-world test of libertarian economic theory, and then, after a few months, stepped away entirely, handing control to other, unnamed operators. Those operators, the defense argues, are the true Dread Pirate Roberts, and they deliberately framed Ross, funneling evidence back to his devices to make him the perfect fall guy while they escaped accountability entirely. It's a bold defense, and Ross backs it, fully argues, so fully that he turns down a plea deal offered by prosecutors, reportedly one that would have carried a sentence of around 10 years. He's confident enough in his legal team's argument that he's willing to bet the rest of his life on a jury believing it. The defense also goes on the offensive against the investigation itself, raising pointed questions about exactly how the FBI managed to locate the Silk Road server in the first place. Federal prosecutors, notably, never fully disclosed the specific technical methods used to trace that Iceland-based server, Euro, and the defense argues this lack of transparency should raise doubts about whether all the evidence in the case was obtained and handled entirely by the book. It's a legitimate legal question, and one that continues to generate debate among legal scholars and privacy advocates well beyond this case. But questions about methodology aren't the same as reasonable doubt about guilt, and the prosecution's case is built on a mountain of material that's difficult to explain away with a framing defense. At the center of it all is Ross's own journal, years of first-person entries describing, often in striking detail, his direct involvement in building, running, and defending Silk Road. Prosecutors also present financial records showing more than $13 million in direct transactions flowing from Silk Road into a digital wallet they tied directly to Ross. Notably, despite the extensive evidence connecting Ross to the murder-for-hire plots, prosecutors are unable to find proof that any of the killings Ross allegedly commissioned were actually carried out, meaning he isn't formally charged in connection with those attempted hits in this trial. But that legal technicality doesn't mean Silk Road left no bodies in its wake. Prosecutors instead focused the courtroom's attention on 6 confirmed deaths connected to substances purchased through the site, overdoses tied directly back to Silk Road transactions. The parents of these victims appear in court to testify, transforming an already high-profile case about technology and ideology into something far more human. Grief, delivered in person, aimed directly at the man they hold responsible. On February 5, 2015, the jury returns its verdict, guilty on all 7 charges. Ross Ulbricht, the Eagle Scout, the physics graduate, the man who once believed he was building a monument to human freedom, is now, legally and formally, a convicted federal criminal. All that remains is for the court to decide exactly what that conviction is going to cost him. Before sentencing, Ross makes one final attempt to influence how this story ends. He writes directly to the judge a letter that reads less like legal strategy and more like a plea from someone finally staring down the full weight of what he's done. In it, Ross acknowledges the severity of his actions, describing what happened as a terrible mistake. He doesn't ask to avoid consequences entirely. He seems to understand that his younger years, the years he might have spent building the legitimate future his early life had pointed toward, are already gone. What he asks for instead is smaller, almost fragile in its specificity. The possibility of an old age lived outside prison walls. A small light left at the far end of an otherwise dark tunnel. A reason to stay healthy. A reason to keep dreaming about a better chapter, however distant. A chance eventually to make something right before his life is over. It's a genuinely human moment, and reading it, it's hard not to see traces of the Eagle Scout underneath everything that came after someone who even now seems to believe that if he can just explain himself clearly enough, some door might still be left open. The judge does not agree. In delivering the sentence, the court describes what Ross built through Silk Road as deeply destructive to the fabric of society, not an abstract libertarian experiment, but a real operation with real, devastating human consequences, including the deaths connected to substances sold through the platform. The sentence handed down is severe even by federal standards. Double life imprisonment, plus an additional 40 years, with no possibility of parole. It's effectively the harshest possible outcome available to the court. A sentence that guarantees Ross will never again experience life outside a federal prison, regardless of behavior, rehabilitation, or the passage of time. For context, individuals convicted of direct, violent murder frequently receive lighter sentences than the one handed to Ross for building and operating a website, a detail that has fueled ongoing debate, well beyond this case, about proportionality in federal drug sentencing. That debate continues in legal and advocacy circles to this day, entirely separate from the question of Ross's guilt, which the jury had already settled. What's not up for debate is the trajectory of the story itself. A young man who once swore to help others and stay morally straight ends up, roughly a decade later, responsible for a criminal enterprise that reshaped how the entire world thinks about the dark web, cryptocurrency, and the true cost of building something you tell yourself is noble, even as it quietly becomes anything but. It's worth going back one more time to where this story actually started, not in a public library in San Francisco, and not even in a Penn State dorm room debating libertarian philosophy, but earlier still. A Boy Scout meeting in Austin, Texas. A kid earning merit badges. A teenager swearing an oath to stay morally straight, to help other people, to do the right thing even when nobody's watching. Nothing about that beginning predicted this ending. That's the part of this story that tends to stick with people longer than the technology, or the Bitcoin, or even the 6 lives connected to substances bought through the site. It's not that a criminal became a criminal. That's not surprising. That's not really a story at all. It's that someone with every apparent advantage, every marker of a promising future, talked himself, one rationalization at a time, into becoming something his younger self would not have recognized and probably would not have forgiven. Ross didn't set out, at 17, planning to run $1 billion criminal marketplace. He set out believing in an idea about freedom and somewhere between that idea and the reality of what it demanded to survive, he crossed lines he almost certainly never imagined himself crossing. Ordering violence, building an empire on substances that ended real lives, losing the people who loved him along the way. The choices that got him there weren't one dramatic decision. They were small ones, made consistently, each one easier to justify than the last, until the distance between Eagle Scout and federal inmate had quietly closed. That's the part worth sitting with, not the drama of the arrest or the scale of the money, but the reminder that the line between who you are and who you could become is rarely crossed all at once. It's crossed one choice at a time. If this story stuck with you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to go even deeper into cases like this, check the playlist linked right below. We're building something here, and I'm glad you're part of it.